of this element. For example, the need to conduct additional Native American tribal consultation, and the need to address greenhouse gas emissions. And then we summarized the existing setting, and you will have links to reports from the town's website that summarize the existing setting. And then finally, we assigned homework. I wanted to go through a couple slides that summarize some of the input that we've been getting. We are reviewing about 550 comments on the general plan update and background settings, and are preparing revised setting sections that reflect that input. We are also, of course, using this input as we think about adjusting the general plan itself, goals and policies, as informed by the input we've been getting. So just a little flavor of what we've been hearing about. There was a discussion of the sensitive nature of mapping both cultural resources and rare biological species. We heard comments that while state law requires energy efficiency in new construction, we can also think about ways to incentivize renewable energy development or energy efficiency improvements to existing buildings and operations in order to make for a more energy efficient community, notwithstanding the fact that state law addresses building energy efficiency to the town's direction in that regard. There's a comment about the town's open spaces, including a limited number of park sites, but mostly being manifest in private space and expansive low density areas and residential, agricultural, residential estate designations, and support for preserving these designations to ensure the town's open space characteristics as they stand today are preserved in this private open space. A comment about the effective multi-use trails requiring parking and thinking about horse use on trails and trailer parking for horses. Comment about the overlap with parks and recreation with regard to making open space effective as natural resource habitat and also supporting recreational activities at the same time. And a comment about making use of open space so that both town residents and tourists may value it. We also received through the open houses this fall and comments that we've received through the GPU email address, comments about supporting maintaining the existing tree canopy and expanding it, minimizing grading and the loss of topography, preserving the existing open space, connect with existing trails and open spaces and providing for multi-uses on existing and new trails. An idea that to expand programming of unique open space. Comments expressing support for uptake of electric vehicles and electrical vehicle charging infrastructure, as well as expansion of solar and other renewable energy technologies. Supporting pedestrian and bicycle travel between key destinations, protecting water quality and loss of salmon and sea ravine, and a comment to, again, maintain and expand existing trees that are in the town. You will likely recognize this slide from before. It's just a general approach for how this update will work. We are reviewing, as I mentioned, the goals, policies, and implementation measures, and keeping the good ones, rewriting those that need more clarity or need to become more relevant, or striking ones that aren't necessary anymore or have already been accomplished. And as well as an organizational strategy where all the goals and policies and implementation measures and objectives will have a numbering system that puts content that is addressing the same topic together in subsections. And finally, we're going to be adding objectives to the general plan. This slide just explains those different terms that I just shared with you: goals, policies, objectives, and implementation measures. And at the top of this slide, you'll see a link to a really great document that explains this all in more detail. But briefly, goals are a broad statement of a desired future. An objective is a way of measuring your progress toward that goal along the way. Policies should be concise statements of the town's position on some topic or commitment to a course of action. And finally, an implementation measure is an action, a program, a procedure that carries out policy. It's like kind of like a to-do list for the town staff. These are some of the questions we're asking ourselves about the existing general plan and how it should be updated, as I shared with you last time. And finally, getting into existing goals, policies, and implementation measures to spur your thinking and your input via the GP update email address. So the existing goals are presented on this slide as they relate to natural resources and cultural resources. So there are goals about protecting sensitive habitats, especially along creeks and riparian areas, protecting water quality, groundwater quality, and air quality, and major open space areas that are in the town today, including topography, rock outcroppings, oak woodlands, and stands of native trees. And then on cultural resources, there are goals about preserving existing historic resources, and then also to encourage cultural activities and events in the town. The existing policies are broken into these categories you see on the slide. And under air quality, you see a summary of policies. Not the full text is included on this particular slide, just for readability. But you see that the existing policies on the books address construction-related air pollutant emissions, require air quality analysis for new development projects. They talk about reducing commute vehicle trips, to plant trees to reduce air contaminant concentrations for sensitive uses, requiring carbon monoxide modeling for new development, coordinating with the air district, pairing residential projects with job producing projects in order to reduce the need for driving or driving long distances, presenting screening levels for project air quality analysis, requiring fair share contribution from new development to fund non-vehicular transportation, and then finally to dedicate land for park and ride lots in the right location in appropriate spots and sizes. A couple things just broadly, we have subcommittee meetings that will dig into these topics in a lot more detail, but this is what's on the books now for air quality. You might think about certain updates. The screening levels that are cited here are much too low to make much sense. 10 pounds per day for any air pollutant emission. Carbon monoxide modeling is not really necessary anymore based on more advanced technology for tailpipe emissions, so that probably should be deleted or reconsidered. I think the last time we shared that transportation is the major source of air pollutant emissions for the air pollution that we care about most, and so really having a focus on land use and transportation and a way to shorten vehicle trips, get people out of their cars, get people walking and biking, or making transit more viable for everyday use really should be the focus for air quality, as well as greenhouse gas emissions and energy. And then updates for clarity probably should be considered as they relate to air quality. The biological resources policy, existing policy is presented here. Basically, it's an implementation measure that requires study of on-site resources and protection of sensitive ecological areas in the course of permitting new development. So really, this is more like an implementation measure, like I shared earlier, rather than a concise statement of policy. And the town might want to think about revising this to be a position, statement of a position and policy, and then maybe move this language into an implementation measure and update it as necessary. There are existing policies you see here related to grading. Again, some policies, some actions mixed in there, limiting grading based on location near significant ecological areas, limiting grading on areas where there are steep slopes, and also relative to hazardous materials, town requiring that industrial commercial uses include a buffer zone to protect the public safety from public safety and also environmental health. That's a hazardous materials related policy that perhaps should be moved to the public health and safety element rather than remaining in the conservation element. Other questions we might think about as it relates to these topics and also biological resources. Should we define and map highly utilized habitat as it's discussed in the existing general plan? Should we have an open space diagram that provides additional guidance on what areas that are sensitive natural habitat areas and ought to be preserved along with new development and public infrastructure projects? Should we think about referencing in the lower density designations on the fringe of the town, referencing clustering for new buildings in order to cluster to preserve open space in the right locations of sensitive nature and cluster buildings in the part of a site that is less sensitive to development, and other considerations you may have in your subcommittee meetings. Under native tree protection, again, here is what's in the existing general plan right now presented as a policy. This is really 5 policies that would be implemented through the trees, through the town's tree ordinance. So we should think about restructuring this one policy to be short statements of a position from the town on native trees, and then point to the tree ordinance as the implementation, as the primary implementation of this policy or these policies. Also might want to think about referencing the town's tree mitigation master plan. Sorry, motorcycles driving by. The town's tree mitigation master plan, which reviews existing properties, public and private properties where tree mitigation could occur in the future, and to compensate for development that must remove trees. And Mary Beth knows a lot about that that document, but it's pretty new. I think it's a 2020 document, so perhaps might want to incorporate some aspect of that tree mitigation master plan in the revised conservation element.
Yeah, I just need to find a moment to pull it together, get it distributed to the committee and post it online. So it will be coming shortly.
Excellent, thank you, Mary Beth. Some of the most important open spaces in the town are along the stream corridors. So appropriately, the existing general plan does include a focus on protecting areas along stream corridors. On the slide that you see before you is the existing policy related to this. But again, this is really more of an implementation measure that describes how stream corridors will be protected as new development occurs. We should consider revising this content to be short statements of commitment or intent in the form of policies. And then maybe this language could be moved to an implementation measure. Also, the stream protection and the, generally the biological resources material in the existing general plan, the policies, really focus on what to protect and how to protect it as development occurs. We also might want to think about proactive policy related to restoring existing resources such as stream corridors, riparian habitat within the town. Just a thought. It might also make sense to have some policy guidance for trail recreational use that would occur along stream corridors in a way that provides recreational opportunities that could be very special, while also being done in a way that's designed and operated to avoid damaging natural resources that are in these areas. The existing general plan addresses water quality, as you see on this slide, which could be rephrased as again a direct statement of policy. And maybe the bullets, the sub-bullets that you see here could be expanded and moved to be instead an implementation measure that would provide all the details on how water quality is to be protected. This policy addresses wetlands and with a lot of detail. Again, it looks more like an implementation measure, more of a program procedure than it is a concise statement of policy. So perhaps we will consider rephrasing as a policy and then move this material into an implementation measure. And then David Weiss also wanted to for us to consider, this policy is focused on wetland areas, which could be state or federal regulated wetlands. And that's great. However, perhaps we could have the language be broad to talk about conserving aquatic resources, which could include state and federal regulated wetlands, but could include other important resources as well. David, did you want to say anything else on that topic?
No, I think you covered it really well. I would just say that aquatic resources, I think, are, like Matthew said, sort of a general broad category, which would include, wetlands in particular, but also the stream corridors that Matthew showed on a previous slide. So perhaps we could have, goals and objectives that talk about aquatic resources, and then we could have, specific policies and implementation measures that deal with those two types of aquatic resources separately, depending on what the town wants to do.
Excellent, thank you. With regard to cultural resources, you see the existing policy content on this slide that has to do with encouraging reuse and revitalization of historic buildings where that's possible, to consider alternative use of historic buildings before they're demolished, to promote cultural activities that would relate to the various cultural resources and historic resources that existed in the town, to prohibit recreational activities that could damage or destroy archaeological sites, and then as a part of the environmental review process, review potential damage to cultural resources and mitigate that where feasible. It also might just, a thought for consideration, historic architectural resources can be preserved, can be restored, and can be reused for and repurposed for other activities. That might require some structural changes, some changes to the space. And we have the Secretary of Interior guidelines that kind of provides the regulatory background on how do you reuse and rebuild a structure, add to it while preserving its historic integrity. Perhaps the general plan in policy or in implementation could provide some objective guidance on how to do that, rather than subjective guidance that might create some uncertainty for property owners that might otherwise be interested in restoring historic resources. Gaps and opportunities. So this is where we start to think about what's on the books now, which we just walked through, and how existing material could be revised, but also think about things that are missing entirely, like policies relating to greenhouse gas emissions and energy. Do we need more protection for certain natural resources, as David just was talking about before? Again, looking at opportunities for co-benefits among different topics: air quality, greenhouse gas emissions reduction, energy. The opportunity to integrate land use and transportation planning to reduce vehicle trip lengths, get people walking and biking instead, having transit be more viable alternative in order to protect air quality and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Thinking about ways to incentivize improvements to existing buildings to improve energy efficiency, integrate with regional planning efforts to promote alternative fueled vehicles like electric vehicles and their charging infrastructure, as well as transit. The relationships between natural resources and cultural resources and tourism for the future. Visual resources probably should have some treatment. That aesthetic resources, visual resources are touched upon in goals, but not really in policy in a clear statement of intent. And then expanding resource protection language to, as David mentioned, include all aquatic resource types, not just federal and state protected wetlands. So we're asking ourselves, what policies need to be revised, what need to be deleted, what implementation measures are needed or revisions to existing implementation, what changes should we make to the general plan. We're receiving input on those topics now through the email address you see presented on this in the middle of this slide, gpupdate@loomis.ca.gov. We'll continue to review the existing setting material and make revisions, as I said, based on the 550 or so comments we've received on the settings reports, and we will provide revised settings posted at the town's website as you provide input on changes to make to the general plan. And finally, our next meeting of this umbrella committee.
One other resource, Matthew. The town
Sorry.
has, yeah, the town has posted its social pinpoint site, so you can physically go in and pinpoint the resources that you want to be examined. And Mary Beth, if you could put the social pinpoint site in the chat so people can get there. But that's a new resource and we're accepting comments on that. And I think as of this afternoon, we're over 600 comments, Matt.
I'm behind.
Regarding the social pinpoint, I'll put it in the chat, but if you go to our Town of Loomis homepage, there's a green banner on the top, and the first item on the left is social pinpoint. But I will put that link in the chat. It's just one of the easiest things to find on our website.
Thank you, Mary Beth and Madam Vice Chair. That concludes my presentation, and I'll pass it back to y'all.
All right, sorry about that. Thank you for understanding. It was a wonderful presentation. And forgive me, items number 2, number 3 were you, Matt, right? I can move on to committee questions because you addressed all that. I don't have to go back over that. So, right?
Correct.
Okay, so we're moving to committee questions of staff now. So anybody with a raised hand?
Melissa Netzel, you may unmute and speak. Press your space bar and hold it. There you go.
Okay. I noticed you mentioned on air quality, reduce peak morning and afternoon vehicle trips. How would you do that, Matthew?
Great question. There are entire graduate level courses on this topic. In fact, you can get an entire degree that specializes, where you could specialize in land use transportation planning, urban design strategies that allow people to reach their workplace without using their car, without having to drive in peak period traffic. So it has to do with putting complementary uses closer together in space. If your job is near your home, that means you can walk or bike to it, or to the store or to the coffee shop, whatever it is, instead of driving to, or schools or parks, any other kinds of destinations close together to home allows people to avoid driving or shorten driving distances. Putting developed uses close together in space also allows transit to be viable as an alternative way of reaching key destinations. So placing homes closer together to one another and closer to a transit stop where you can walk within a quarter mile of it, it provides another alternative to auto trips. Those are just maybe some. Anybody else on the call have other examples? It is an intractable issue. It's very difficult after development has occurred to reverse engineer it so that it works for walking and biking. So these are sorts of things that are appropriate for a general plan and a long-term view on how over time to make it more practical, safe, comfortable for people to walk and bike to uses rather than driving.
Actually, the Circulation Committee is going to be having a presentation by the Rural Main Street Program. And Mary Beth, that's next week, correct, at the Circulation Committee?
Yeah, it's actually, we did this same meeting. It's called the Loomis Streetscapes Workshop, and it was presented by Local Government Commission in association with SACOG, Sacramento Area Council of Governments. And it was a presentation to the downtown Taylor Business Corridor on streetscape. And it was real engaging and interactive mapping exercise that the committee members got to actually talk out what problems there were with downtown type things.
And it also, it really moved into finding ways to shorten our path. We talked about trails, we talked about bicycles. So it's the reason that it was suggested that the same presentation be given to the Circulation Committee, because it really did get into how can Loomis begin to reduce its transit or its auto dependency. So I would suggest if you can participate or observe that presentation and possibly contribute to it. But a good presentation, really good discussion we had last week.
Yeah,
so that was last week?
Yeah, it was last Thursday.
Thank you.
And yeah, you can watch the video through our YouTube channel. It was the 3 o'clock Taylor Road Downtown Business Corridor meeting. And this next presentation to Circulation will leave out the downtown portion, but totally look at circulation throughout all of Loomis and have that interactive experience. We had about 25 people on the call for last week's meeting, and it went really well. Everybody, there was no separation because it's a workshop. So committee members and public attendees all interacted together, and it ran very smoothly.
I'm so glad to hear you guys are considering this, because 20 years ago, I was going from Rockland to Howe Avenue. Took 3 hours, one trip, one way. So,
Wow.
3 buses. So that's good. Good job, guys.
Okay, Jesse, you're up.
First of all, Melissa, I think it's a great point. And I think Loomis is the problem. When you give up your office professional space, when you give up your commercial space, you make us commuters. At that point, green gases go through the roof. So each time a developer comes through and we allow changes to jobs, changes to the houses, it increases those problems. We saw it in the last development. We gave up office professional, we gave up general commercial, We'll see with the next developer across the highway, do we give up the tourist destination, down those jobs? We give them up, we become more commuters, become more green gas. But my question, after your great question, was back when we were talking about writing goals and policies, we talked about goals, objectives, policies, and actions. I thought when we talked about objectives, that was used as a measuring goal. When we flip one page over, we talk about existing goals. These are the existing things that are happening in Lumens today. Natural resources. How are we measuring what we did in the past so we know where we're going forward in the future?
Well, one way is comparing our settings sections, which detail what's going on today, and compare that to the 2001 goals, and make, with that comparison, you might be able to start to ascertain, okay, we have this existing condition today, and yet we had this goal in 2001 to not let that occur. And that might be where the goal was not realized. On the other hand, for example, with respect to economic development, a lot of the input that I'm receiving is that, yes, the town has been taking a lot of actions to assist locally owned business. And in fact, the town has accomplished its economic development goals and has implemented its policies. There may be places where there's some divergence. There may be places where there's a lot of consonance along those lines. And then, as you mentioned, if because the general plan doesn't have a lot of objectives today, little measuring sticks that allow us to, over time, see whether we're moving toward the goals, we will add that feature this time around so that the process that you're talking about is much easier looking forward.
Thank you. That's what I mean. Without a measuring stick, how do we know if we're doing good, bad, or lukewarm?
Jesse, one other tool to take a look at is called the annual progress report that is put together. Mary Beth puts this together. It's supposed to be adopted and to the state by April of every year. So I think that has been done this year. But it goes through the general plan goals, objectives, and identifies what has been accomplished in the prior year. So it's year to year to year.
Where can I find this measuring natural resources?
Mary Beth?
Yeah, Jesse, I was looking there today, and what's posted there is the 2019 APR, and I have on my list to get the 2020 up there. So I can't say it'll be tomorrow, but definitely next week. And I will send a link to that to this committee once it's posted, so you have it for me.
Great. Can't ask for anything more. Thank you very much.
And just be aware that, as Matthew said, the prior general plan really didn't have the objective standards. So as we develop objective standards, it's going to be a lot easier to report on an annual basis just how much progress we're making. And just so you know, the reason it comes out in April is so that the town council can also consider their budget. And if there's something they want to budget for to solve a problem, they look at the APR, say, we're not achieving our general plan. We need to pick and do something to achieve the general plan and put it in the budget. So there's a rationale behind the annual progress report each spring.
Thank you very much.
Can I talk? I have my, okay. So just to real quick piggyback on what Jesse was saying, it seems like a lot of, and Andrew's kind of mentioned this in that too, that it should be easy to put in objective standards into these because a lot of the stuff is measurable. I mean, you could say, we have a tree canopy now. We only want to reduce it by, say, at most 90% or expand it by 110% or something. And that's all measurable with satellites. Trail lengths, same thing. I mean, it should be, what numbers we use are completely up for grabs, but putting numbers in should not be very difficult, in my opinion. I had two comments I wanted to make. The first was the possibility of adding agricultural spaces to maybe cultural spaces, historical and cultural spaces, because one of the things that came up in the, what was it, the Rural Main Street Technical Assistance Program, when in her presentation, I think she pointed out that we have very limited number of actual continuously used agricultural spaces, and it was a lot smaller than I was expecting it to be in that. And so I don't know if that's something that the committee wants to consider. But then let's see, there's a, oh, and then would we, if we wanted to add something along the lines of, climate change or global warming or anything else, would that just fall into, I mean, it seems like you could easily wrap that into air quality as well. Or would it be important enough to, I mean, to me, I think it would be, I think it would be important enough to have its own goal to be trying to reduce that, but we can do that with energy. And I mean, it would be, it would include all of the other ones, like the air quality and the energy and the natural resources as well. And so I'm just throwing that out to the committee that I wonder, oh, and then there's one other thing. I wonder if that would be important for the committee to consider. And then the last thing is that with during your presentation, there was a lot, Matthew, there was a lot of, in almost every slide when you're going through the goals, it was like, should we do this, or can we do this, or we should, or we can, and I have almost zero experience writing any of these policy statements. And so I don't know how anybody else on the committee has any experience doing that either, but it seems like what would be beneficial to me on this committee would be if you had come up with, or in the future, if you come up with policies that do what you think should be done roughly, and then say, hey, we, like for instance, with the tree canopies, just say, hey, we've got, right now, we only want to limit it to keeping the tree canopy to 100%. We don't want to lose anything at all. And then the committee can then, kind of juggle with what the numbers they're looking at. But I have because everything you said, oh, we should do this, or we can do that. And I was like, I don't know how I would even go about writing. I agree exactly with what you're saying. Yes, we should. But how do I do that? I don't know what to do in that case. And so I'm wondering if that would be possible. It puts more work on you and less work on us, obviously. But at the same time, I don't know what I'm doing. And so it's way more helpful, I think.
To respond to a portion of that, Matthew, David and committee, I just posted in the chat a link to a document that was prepared by one of our land use technical staff. And it's called The Art of Writing Goals, Objectives, and Policies. And it is posted on our website. It's kind of new out there. I think it was last week that came forward. So I just gave you a link for that.
Was that the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, he had that linked in his PowerPoint presentation.
Okay.
I've got that up. I haven't read it, obviously, but
okay. Yeah.
But I've got that up now. So,
David, just so you know, the role of the technical staff is to write the goals and policies and objectives. We're looking for you to say, heck no, leave it just the way it is, or yeah, that makes sense. Go forward.
Good.
And that's the kind of direction we're looking for. Honestly, we're listening to what you say, and we will try to pull out the appropriate goals, objectives, etc., from what we hear you saying. So feel absolutely free to have a discussion, and we're looking for, does this make sense? Which you said, Matthew, made sense. So that is like, let's move forward. But if there's something you want to see that hasn't been seen, I think Jesse brought up more quantifiable objectives when it comes to some of the conservation matters. Those are all things we can do. So we're listening, and it's up to us to write that stuff. And the next round, we should be bringing back to you the goals, policies that in an underline or in a legislative mode, so you can begin considering doing that. So
okay, excellent.
Thank
you.
Today is kind of the first look at goals and policies. And what direction do you want to take? What are you looking for in the town of Loomis? And we're just going to pay attention and then begin writing that.
Yeah, thank you.
Russ Kelly posted a matter in the chat, and he says, I didn't see anything about NEV lanes. So I believe that would be addressed in the circulation element. But my overall comment is, how does this umbrella committee work with the subcommittees and then the other elements? I think that's a good segue into how all of these things interact, so that the committee has an understanding of what their goals are.
Let me try and answer that. Basically, this committee will be receiving reports from the other subcommittees. Your committee then will report to the Planning Commission. The general plan is messy. Everything interrelates to everything else. So allow us, as your technical staff, to kind of figure out where best to play it. Matthew was already talking about some of those tonight. But there will be cross references and linkages between these elements. So say in the conservation element, if there are policies that you want to reduce greenhouse gases through reduction of VMT, it may have a section in the introduction saying, hey, go see the circulation element. These are the goals and policies that relate to conservation, but they're actually in the circulation element. They all apply. We're repeating them for your information, but we're not repeating them as part of this element. So there will be a section of related goals, policies, objectives, so that you understand the complexity of a general plan and its interrelationship. So our job as your technical staff is to figure out the best place to put those and then make sure it's referenced in this element as appropriate.
Russ Kelly, you're on board.
Okay, I'm looking at these things that we want to get to, and I like to look at things like what are the hurdles, and as we look at things, I like to know how we're going to get there. Is it a financial thing? Is it a pie in the sky thing? Is it futuristic? And I think that some of the things that we need to do are going to border on futuristic things that we can come up with better ideas than other people have used, and maybe they'll enjoy trying to use ours. But I don't want to write things in the general plan that are absolutely unattainable. And I'd like to know about how long it's going to take to attain this. And then I think that needs to go into the some kind of a report so that we can identify, are we making headway? Or are we finding that this is an impossible task? I don't believe that. I do believe that you can do anything you set your mind to do if you got enough money, depending on what your needs are to be able to attain that. So I'd like to keep it so that we can live with it, so that we can enjoy it and be part of it.
Yeah, within the general plan, one of the things that will be done is, especially for the implementation measures, which is kind of that where the rubber hits the road, have a time frame, and that time frame generally it's an ongoing action that the town needs to take, or it's a short term, which generally means 1 to 5 years, which is typically within a budget achievable period. You have midterm, which is that 5 to 15 years or so, and then long term, which is 15 or more, and that may go beyond the scope of the general plan. So as we're writing the implementation measures, we'll be looking at what makes sense, what we can achieve, and those definitely will be then tracked and recorded within the annual progress report, so you can see progress on each of those.
Considering what you folks have helped us do already, I think that I can appreciate that a lot. Although when I was on the council, we did a road survey. We said, okay, how soon we need these, fix these roads and whatever. And we came up with the funding for that, which was $68 million, which is still not attainable, and it still hasn't got a lot of our roads fixed. So it's identifying those things that we may have a much harder time with. I think I would appreciate that as you move forward.
Well, one of the things that we have done is we've moved the economic development element and combined it with the financial element. And so Matthew's in charge of that. And we will be talking about the financial feasibility of, what can be achieved on an annual basis. And it's a tough one given the income that the town of Loomis has, but a necessary one.
Thank you.
Jesse?
Russ brought up the NEDs. The town did a study about 10 years ago. Where that report is, I have no idea, Gil, where it is, but it was done about 10 years ago. At that point, we were looking to be a little bit more like Lincoln Hills and letting some of the golf carts use some of the roads. Also, we talked about the existing goals. Just so you know, you're going to hear endlessly from me when it comes to maintaining, preserving the creeks and the wildlife. I'm on the Parks and Rec, so again, it all ties in, and that's one of the strongest things I'll be pushing over the next few months. Thank you.
Lorraine, you're up next.
Okay, thank you. I would like just a little bit more clarification. If we are going to include something under this committee on climate change, it appears to me that if I just think about it briefly, I'm looking at fire, water, air, transit, energy, electric cars, environmental justice, agriculture, habitat protection. What's going to happen to the workers at gas stations versus charging stations? Are there any people here who are going to have to transition their jobs because of climate change? But do we just address overall that we would want to address it, and then it comes into each section? And I believe, once again, that there will be state and federal resources, some available to assist us in this sort of transition. Who is responsible in terms of implementation and attempting to look for those resources so that we can take advantage of them if we have a statement that says we'd like to, prevent our community from burning down and lacking water? Thank you.
Through the Vice Chair and Mary Beth, do you mind if I respond? Okay.
Go ahead.
You're right. One could organize an entire general plan around greenhouse gas emissions and climate change if you wanted to. Those topics touch everything in a community, including its economic resilience, as you pointed out. I think here, as Andy mentioned, there'll be need for cross-referencing. Transportation is the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the town and in the county, and the top source of air pollutant emissions. So in this element, we're going to need to cross-reference what's being done in land use and transportation to reduce vehicle trips. But I think generally, how I see this, and I'm open-minded obviously to everybody's input, is that reducing greenhouse gas emissions would be a topic for the conservation of resources element, this element. Adapting to a future changed climate would be a topic that I think better fits in the public health and safety element, more of a, as you're talking about wildfire risk and water supply interruptions and extreme heat events. Those are all things that relate a little bit more to public health and safety than they do conservation of resources. So I think we have kind of a two element approach to addressing that suite of topics that you just rose. And then the other question was about funding related to climate change. Yes, there already is funding available to local governments. I mean, there has been for many years to support climate action planning, to development of strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and then also money for resiliency adaptation through the state government and some regional sources as well. And looking forward, you know, obviously we're going to have a lot of, you know, the president's talking, you know, pretty much right now about a big infusion of money into the economy, supporting active transportation, climate change mitigation, environmental justice, and reducing pollution in more disadvantaged communities, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and adapting to a future climate. All those things are totally germane to what's actively being discussed in Washington, which will produce a huge pot of funding, but it's not, these are not items that federal government itself mostly implements. Instead, that funding goes through all the normal channels, through the regional transportation planning agency, for example, to the local governments themselves, who would identify projects that could be the subject of grant funding. And, you know, town staff monitors those sorts of opportunities. And I anticipate that in this element, and perhaps in the economic development and finance element, we would have implementation that talks about active, proactive monitoring of available grant funding to fund the town's priorities, and to making a good match between physical things the town wants to fund, general plan, and what grant programs are a good match for those same pots of funding. I realize that I've just added to Mary Beth's to-do list without her being able to talk and being on mute, but I guess that's the best way to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Jesse.
There we go. Oh.
There you go.
Last January 2020, the town, looking at the agenda sheet for the town council, item 8 authorized the town manager to enter into a consulting contract to provide additional arborist consulting services for the tree mitigation master plan. Any way we can have that plan, whatever it was, report up to this meeting also?
Yes, we talked about that a little earlier. I will resurrect that report and get it posted and out to the committee.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Just so you know, David put that report together, Jesse, and much of that information is in the settings section for this element that Jesse or that David put together.
Well, I won't take credit for it. Helix put it together. I didn't personally do it, but yeah. So just for your information, Jesse, so we did utilize some of the findings for that in the updating of the settings section for the biological resources portion, specifically about tree mapping and canopy cover, things like that that are discussed currently. So some of that data did get incorporated.
Did we get our money's worth?
Yes, you did. You did.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andy.
Madam
And
Chair?
just so you know, that was an evolving process, and Helix was very flexible in addressing, you know, they would do a report, we'd find something, we'd say, we need to know this now. And so, yeah, they were very responsive and got us the information that was necessary.
Madam Vice Chair, I see no other committee members with their hands raised. At this time, can we open it up for public comments?
We absolutely can. Thank you very much for letting me know there's no more hands raised.
Thank you. Our public attending, Jean Wilson, do you have any comments on this matter? You would just have to unmute.
No comments. You're doing a good job. Covered a lot of ground tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. and then we turn it back to the committee.
So committee deliberation and direction. Any?
I think the direction I got was to forward some documents to the committee, which I will do by next week. Give me a chance to pull that stuff together. Jesse, I was just looking on our server for that consultant contract from about 10 years ago. And I found a staff report, but I just have to dig through the minutes. So I'll be compiling that stuff too, and at least report back to the committee what happened on that town council matter for the NEB study.
I think the other action I heard was direction to Matthew and David to proceed forward implementing the goals, policies, objectives as a generally provided direction tonight at tonight's meeting, and bringing it back for your consideration and debate.
So I guess that wraps up our deliberation and direction, and kind
So-
of also includes the recommendation. I'm sorry.
I
Go
was
ahead.
going to ask you, is there a recommendation, Ray Beth? I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's what I was going to say. Any other recommendations to staff?
I just want to make a quick comment. Jean, public comment is closed, but Jean has her hand up, so I don't know if she's, if we can recognize that or if that's on purpose.
Yes, no. Jean, go ahead, unmute.
I just wondered if you could post the send the documents also to me or other attendees. If particularly if they're relevant for the two subcommittees for this. Some may be and some may be not, but people might be interested for the subcommittees. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean.
So if there's no more recommendation or questions, I could say briefly that the next meeting is Wednesday, May 26th at 7 p.m. Is everybody in agreement of that? Any other comments or?
Seeing none, Madam Chair.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your consideration tonight, considering the chairman is out. This is my first time and I appreciate everybody's support. I will go ahead and adjourn the meeting if there's no other questions or comments at 8:13 p.m. See you all next month.
Thanks.
you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good job, Stephanie.
Thank you. See you next time. Goodbye.